In the cold, clear autumn of 1987, 26-year-old Wren Calloway inherited the particular silence that settles over a farm when the money has finally run out. Her father, Edmund Calloway, had died in July, 3 weeks after the last good rain, leaving her 180 acres of tired Saskatchewan grainland, a John Deere tractor with a cracked head gasket, and a debt to the credit union in Bigger that she tried not to think about before bed. She also inherited his boots, still caked with the pale, powdery soil that had become the farm's signature in his final years. Soil that crumbled to dust in your fingers. Soil that had forgotten how to hold water. The land had been in the Calloway family for 3 generations, broken from the prairie by her grandfather, with a team of horses and a borrowed plow. Edmund had farmed it in wheat, wall to wall, year after year the way his father had, and his father before him. It was not stubbornness so much as it was faith in the system, in the elevator prices, in the government programs, in the agronomists from the university who came around in their pickup trucks and wrote their recommendations in duplicate on carbon paper. He had done everything right by the standards of his time. He had applied the inputs, rotated his nitrogen, managed his moisture, and still, in the last decade of his life, the yields had dropped and the costs had climbed, and the gap between the two had swallowed everything. What Edmund left Wren, besides the debt and the boots, were his notebooks. Not a dramatic stack of leather journals. Her father was not a romantic man. They were spiral-bound scribblers from the co-op hardware, the kind with the mottled black and white covers stacked in 3 cardboard boxes in the back of his study. She had known about them her whole childhood, had seen him writing in them at the kitchen table after supper while the CBC played in the other room. She had assumed they were financial records, crop notes, the kind of bookkeeping any farmer kept. It was only after he was gone that she sat down and read them properly and realized they were something else entirely. Edmund Calloway had spent the last 15 years of his life writing down questions, not answers, observations that had nowhere to go. The Slough in the East Quarter doesn't drain the way it used to. The cattails are thinner. The red-winged blackbirds that used to nest there, 4 pairs at least. I only counted 1 this year. Where did the water go? Not evaporation. Something slower. He had written about the way the runoff from the fields carried a thin, chalky film after heavy rains. He had sketched the drainage patterns of the land from memory, noting where the water moved too fast and where it pooled and went rancid. He had written, in the margin of a page from 1982, a sentence that Wren read 3 times before she moved on. The soil is not tired. It is empty. There is a difference. She sat with that sentence for a long time. The men at the co-op said what they always said: the land needed phosphorus. It needed a shot of 32% nitrogen to get the next crop going. There were new seed varieties, drought-tolerant, shorter season, bred for exactly this kind of challenged soil. The Extension Office had programs. There were loans available at rates that sounded reasonable until you did the math. They spoke with the patient, faintly condescending confidence of people who have said the same thing many times and found it generally sufficient. They meant well, most of them. They were not bad men. They were simply men who had been handed the same set of tools for so long that they had stopped wondering whether a different tool might exist. Wren listened. She thanked them. She drove home on the grid road with the windows down, watching the field margins, and she thought about her father's notebooks. What she did next is the part that made her a subject of conversation at the Bigger diner for the better part of 3 years. She called a man in Saskatoon she had read about in a second-hand copy of an organic farming newsletter she'd found at the library. He was not a professor or an extension agent or a government official. He was a retired soil scientist named Mr. Bergman, who had spent 20 years working in Alberta before concluding that the conventional model had a fundamental flaw and had retired to argue about it in newsletters. He drove out to the farm on a gray October morning in a rusting Volvo, walked the fields for 2 hours without saying much, knelt down at intervals to crumble the soil between his fingers, and finally came back to the kitchen and accepted a cup of tea. "Your father was right," he said, reading the notebook pages Wren had marked. "Not empty. Depleted of life, the microbiological community is collapsed. You can pour nitrogen on this all day. The plants will take it up, but the soil itself won't heal. You're feeding the crop and starving the ground." What Wren asked him next surprised even her. "What does the ground eat?" Mr. Bergman looked at her over his tea. He was a tall, angular man with the careful eyes of someone who had spent a great deal of time looking at things other people walked past. "Carbon," he said. "Organic matter, living roots, living soil organisms, biological activity. The whole system working together the way it would have worked before your grandfather broke it." He paused. "And water that's alive, not water that's been sitting in a chemical sea." She drove him to the East Quarter, to the slough her father had written about. It had shrunk to less than a third of its original size, ringed with cracked mud. She told him what her father had observed: the film on the runoff water, the changes in the drainage, the disappearing birds. Mr. Bergman crouched at the water's edge for a long time, poking at the sediment with a stick, smelling it. "Anaerobic," he said. "Dead water. Whatever you pump from this onto your fields is carrying almost nothing useful." He stood up. "You know what this water needs? It needs oxygen. It needs biology. It needs something living in it to process the nutrients that are already here and make them available to your soil." He drove back to Saskatoon that afternoon, but before he left, he handed Wren a folded sheet of paper with some notes on it and 2 names. One of a man in Manitoba who had been experimenting with constructed wetlands, and one of a woman in British Columbia doing research on biological nutrient cycling in agricultural water systems. "I can't tell you what to do," he said, leaning out the Volvo window. "But I can tell you that the answer is probably in that slough. Your father was standing in front of it for 20 years. Now, let me stop here and ask you something, because I think it matters. Have you ever looked at a problem so long that you stopped seeing it as a problem and started seeing it as just the way things are?" The slough had been there Wren's entire life. It had been there her father's entire life. It was simply part of the farm, like the granary or the windbreak. The idea that it might be a resource, that the dying water on the edge of the failing field might be the beginning of the solution rather than a symptom of it, required a particular kind of vision. The kind that comes not from expertise, but from the willingness to ask a question that sounds foolish until it doesn't. Wren spent the winter reading. She wrote letters, actual letters, because this was 1987, to the 2 names Mr. Bergman had given her. She borrowed books from the university library through interlibrary loan and read them at the kitchen table under the lamp her father had used for his scribblers. She learned about aquatic biology, about the nitrogen cycle, about the relationship between water oxygen levels and bacterial communities, about the way healthy wetlands naturally process and release nutrients in forms that plants can absorb. She learned that what her father's slough had once been, what every prairie slough had once been, was a biological engine, and that decades of drainage, chemical runoff, and neglect had shut that engine down. By March, she had a plan. It was not a plan she could easily explain to anyone in Bigger without getting a particular look in return. She used the last of her operating line of credit, not for seed or fertilizer, but for 3 things. A small electric aerator pump, the kind used in commercial fish ponds, enough plastic pipe to run a circulation loop through the slough, and into the main field drainage ditch, and 120 yellow perch, sourced from a fish farm near Prince Albert, packed into aerated transport bags and loaded into the back of her truck on a cold April morning. The perch were native to Saskatchewan. This was not an accident. She had read enough to know that introducing a non-native species into a drainage system connected to natural waterways was both ecologically reckless and likely illegal. Yellow perch were already present in the local watershed. They were cold water hardy, adapted to prairie conditions, and their feeding behavior, bottom feeding and stirring sediment, would help oxygenate the slough floor in ways the pump alone could not. She backed the truck to the slough bank and released them. The fish scattered into the murky water and disappeared. It was not a dramatic moment. The sky was flat and gray, and there was still a skin of ice along the north edge of the Slough. Her nearest neighbor, a man named Mr. Arsenault, whose section bordered hers to the west, happened to be driving the grid road and stopped his truck to watch. "What are you doing?" he called from the window. "Stocking the Slough," Wren said. "With what?" "Perch." Mr. Arsenault was quiet for a moment. He was a practical man, not unkind, with the kind of face that had been weathered into a permanent expression of cautious assessment. "For eating?" he finally asked. "For farming," she said. He drove away without saying anything further. But he told people, and the people told other people, and by the following week there was a general understanding in the community that Edmund Calloway's daughter had come home from the city with some ideas, and it was going to be a hard thing to watch. The official response came in May. A man named Mr. Kowalski from the Provincial Agriculture Extension Office drove out in a white government truck. He had been sent, he explained with practiced diplomacy, because there had been some questions raised about the management of drainage water and the introduction of fish species into agricultural water systems that might have implications for provincial drainage regulations. He was not there to cause trouble. He was there to help her understand the framework. He walked the slough with her, clipboard in hand, and she could hear the pump running its soft, steady churn beneath the surface. The water already looked different, lighter, with a faint greenish cast where before there had been only brown opacity. Mr. Kowalski took notes. He explained the regulations. He explained the cost-sharing programs available for proper tile drainage. He explained the new nitrogen management guidelines from the university that showed promising results on degraded soils comparable to hers. He was thorough and well-meaning, and he had a pamphlet for everything. "Miss Calloway," he said at last, looking at the slough with an expression of professional puzzlement, "I understand what you're trying to do conceptually, but I have to be direct with you. The scale of biological remediation you're describing, rebuilding the soil microbial community through water-based nutrient cycling, this isn't a validated approach in Saskatchewan agriculture. It hasn't been through proper trials. You're making decisions about your operation based on some notebook observations and some conversations with." He glanced at his notes. "A retired researcher who is not affiliated with any current institution, and my own observations," Wren said. "Yes," he said carefully, "yours as well." He made his notes and drove away. He did not find her. The perch were native species, the pump was legal, and the drainage modifications were within the scope of a landowner's rights. But he filed a report, and the report noted that the Calloway operation in the rural municipality of Bigar was pursuing an unvalidated biological approach to soil remediation and should be monitored. The second pressure came later that summer from a different direction. A sales representative named Mr. Lachance drove up from Regina in a company car and walked into her yard with the easy confidence of a man who has converted many skeptics. He sold a full-spectrum soil amendment program: nitrogen, phosphorus, micronutrient package, plus a new polymer soil conditioner that, he explained, had shown dramatic results on depleted prairie soils. He had testimonials. He had yield comparisons. He had a financing plan with deferred payments until after the harvest. He had done his homework. He knew the farm's debt load. He knew she had taken no fertilizer inputs for a year. He knew the yield from the south field last season had been poor. He was sympathetic and practical. And his offer was genuinely tempting in the way that only offers are tempting when you're frightened. "I hear what you're trying to do," he said, leaning against the hood of his car with his arms crossed in what he imagined was a posture of collegial understanding. "And I respect it, honestly. But here's the thing. You can't afford a philosophy. You need a crop. One bad year on top of the debt you're already carrying and this place is done. My program gets you a crop this season. You pay it back from the yield. And next year you're in a better position to try your experiments." Wren looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, she could see the south field, where the wheat had gone in without any commercial input for the first time in the farm's history. It was thin. She knew it was thin. "My father tried your program," she said, "not yours specifically, but the same logic, for 30 years, and the soil got worse every year." "The science has improved," Mr. Lachance said. "The soil hasn't," she said. "Thank you for the drive, Mr. Lachance." He left his card. She used it as a bookmark in one of her library books and forgot about it. "Let me tell you about Edmund Callaway, because you need to understand what Wren was carrying. He was not an educated man by any formal measure, a high school diploma from the bigger school, and 40 years of watching the same fields from the same vantage points, which amounts to a different kind of education entirely. He was not a man who talked much. He expressed things in the scribblers when he couldn't express them any other way. What he had understood, slowly, over the last 15 years of his life, was that the farm he had inherited was a system, and that somewhere in the decades of industrial agriculture, the parts of that system that didn't show up on a balance sheet had been quietly dying: the birds, the insects, the soil organisms, the water. He didn't have the vocabulary for what he was observing. He wasn't an ecologist or a biologist. He was a farmer who had started noticing the wrong things and couldn't stop. And in the margin of a scribbler from 1984, 3 years before he died, he had written something Wren had not shown to anyone. "I wonder if I've been farming wrong my whole life. I wonder if my father did too. I wonder if anyone has been brave enough to say so out loud." Wren had been brave enough, or perhaps she had simply run out of alternatives, which can look like the same thing from the outside. The first summer was hard. The wheat in the south field came in at 60% of the county average. She knew it would. She had planned for it. She had cut everything else she could cut, hired no help, deferred every repair that could be deferred, grown a garden large enough to feed herself through the winter without buying groceries. She had a small emergency fund, money set aside from a part-time bookkeeping job she'd held in town through the previous winter, and she watched it carefully. What she watched more carefully was the slough. By midsummer, the change was visible. The water had cleared, not dramatically. It was still a prairie slough, not a swimming pool, but the opacity had lifted, and there was life in it. Aquatic plants had begun to re-establish along the margins. The red-winged blackbirds her father had written about, he had noted their decline every year since 1979, had returned. She counted 3 nesting pairs in July. She wrote it in a new scribbler she had bought, at the same co-op where her father had bought his. At the field margins, where the water from the slough drained through the circulation pipe and out into the field ditch, something was happening to the soil. It was subtle, and she almost missed it. The pale, powdery surface was darkening slightly at the edges, Where the water touched first, she crouched down and crumbled it in her fingers. It was still not good soil, but it was different soil. It had a texture she hadn't felt in that field before, a slight cohesion, a faint smell of earth rather than dust. She sent a soil sample to the university lab in Saskatoon, sealed in a box without a return address, because she couldn't bear the particular kind of feedback she imagined receiving if they knew who it was from. The results came back to her post office box 6 weeks later. Organic matter content, 0.8%, up from 0.4 when she had tested it 2 years before her father died. Microbial activity, elevated, flagged for unusual reading. The lab technician had written a handwritten note in the margin. Interesting sample. What's the management history here? She didn't write back, but she taped the note to the wall above her father's desk. There was a moment near the end of the second summer that she has never fully described to anyone. It came in the last week of August, during a stretch of hot, dry weather that had settled over central Saskatchewan like a held breath. The crops in the surrounding sections were burning at the edges. Mr. Arsenault's canola, which had looked promising in July, was dropping its pods early. She drove the grid road in the evening and watched the dust rising from the fields, watched the pale yellow of stressed crops against the flat sky. Her own wheat was not perfect, but it was standing. She sat on the tailgate of her truck at the edge of the south field and let herself feel the full weight of what she was doing. The debt, the doubt, the isolation of a decision nobody around her understood. She thought about driving into Biggar the next morning and calling the bank. She thought about what it would feel like to hand the problem to someone else, to follow the instructions, to stop being the strange woman who put fish in the slough. For about an hour, she seriously considered it. Then she drove back to the house, went into the study, and opened the scribbler from 1984. She read her father's question. I wonder if anyone has been brave enough to say so out loud. She closed the book. She did not drive into Biggar the next morning. The third year was when things began to change in ways that other people could see. The soil organic matter in the south field had reached 1.4%. She found earthworms. She hadn't seen earthworms in that field in memory, and she had grown up playing in those fields as a child. The wheat that year came in at 92% of the county average, using no commercial fertilizer and no synthetic pesticide. Her total input costs for the season were a fraction of what Mr. Arsenault spent per acre. She made a modest profit, the first in 3 years. She also noticed that summer that the perch were thriving. There were more of them than she had introduced, significantly more, given that perch reproduce readily in the right conditions. The slough, which the aerator and the circulation system had oxygenated and stabilized, had become genuinely productive habitat. She made a decision that addressed a question she had been thinking about since the beginning. She began netting the surplus perch, carefully managing the population and selling them to a fish market in Saskatoon. It was not a large income, but it was income that came from the same system she had built to heal the soil, which meant the system was paying for itself in more than one direction at once. She told no one about the soil tests. She told no one about the earthworms. She kept the scribbler notes and the lab results in the cardboard boxes with her father's, and she kept working. In the fourth year, a drought hit central Saskatchewan that older farmers said was the worst since the 50s. It came hard in July and stayed through September. Water licenses were being called in across the province. Municipal restrictions were tightening. The grain elevators in Biggar took on the particular quiet that comes when everyone is running numbers and hoping they're wrong. Slough did not go dry because the circulation system had been maintaining it for 3 years. Managing water movement, limiting evaporation, through the plant cover that had re-established along the margins, filtering the incoming field water. The slough retained moisture that the open, bare-edged prairie sloughs around it lost quickly, and her soil, with its now measurable organic content and active microbial community, held the water it received in a way that the depleted, compacted soil of the surrounding farms simply could not. The water went in and stayed. The roots found it and used it. Her yield that year, in the drought year, came in at 108% of the county average. The numbers were posted at the elevator, as they always were. And the conversation in the bigger diner changed. It changed slowly, the way suspicion always changes when confronted with evidence. Not all at once, not graciously, but in the halting way of people who were certain and are now less certain and do not particularly enjoy the sensation. Mr. Arsenault stopped in the road one afternoon when he saw her walking the field margin, and they talked through the fence wire for 20 minutes. He was not a man who asked for things easily, but he was also a practical man. "Your father had ideas," he said finally. "We thought he was just." He stopped. "We thought he hadn't kept up." "He was keeping up with something else," Wren said. "He just didn't know what to do with it yet." The harder conversation came 2 years later, when a man named Mr. Lachance returned. Not the same Mr. Lachance from the fertilizer company, but a different representative from the same company, or so she assumed. He drove the same kind of car. He had the same quality of rehearsed ease. He had heard about the yields. His company was, he explained, exploring partnerships with innovative operators who were achieving results through. He searched for the phrase, integrated biological management approaches. They were interested in what she had built. They had corporate customers, grocery chains, retailers, who were looking for suppliers with verifiable regenerative credentials. There was a program they were developing. There was money in it. He sat at her kitchen table, and to his credit, he did not try to be condescending. He had done his homework better than his predecessor. He knew the soil test numbers. She wasn't sure how. He knew about the Perch sales. He was genuinely curious, and she could see that the curiosity was not entirely strategic. "What you've done here is remarkable," he said, "and I mean that plainly, not as a sales approach. The question is whether it can scale, whether it can be documented, replicated, productized. My company would pay well for the methodology. We'd bring in a research team, run proper trials, build a commercial protocol. You'd be credited as the originator. You'd have a royalty structure." Wren poured herself tea and looked out the window at the east quarter, where the slough sat in the late afternoon light, the water catching the low sun, the cattails dense along the margin. "The difficulty," she said finally, "is that what I built isn't a methodology. It's a relationship. It's this slough, this soil, these fields, the water that my grandfather channeled, the biology that survived what my father's generation accidentally tried to kill. I spent 4 years listening to this specific piece of land. I couldn't package that for someone else's fields any more than I could package what my father knew about how the sky looks before snow in October." She paused. "The principles travel. The recipe doesn't. And the moment you try to sell the recipe, you stop paying attention to the land you're standing on. That's how we got here in the first place." He was quiet for a moment. He was a smarter man than his predecessor, and she could see him genuinely processing what she had said, which she appreciated. "You know you could be very wealthy," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm all right." He left politely, and she stood at the door and watched the car disappear down the grid road, and she felt nothing in particular, which she recognized as a kind of contentment she hadn't known when she was younger. What happened in the years that followed is a quieter story, but it is the one that lasts. The farm debt was paid off in full in the 8th year of Wren's management. She framed the paid-off credit note and hung it in the study next to the lab technician's handwritten question. In the years after that, when other farms in the municipality began to struggle, the cost-price squeeze that had been building for a decade finally arriving in full, Wren did not expand aggressively or buy distressed land cheaply. But when Mr. Arsenault's son, who had taken over his father's operation, came to her one winter afternoon and asked if she would walk his fields with him and look at the sloughs and tell him what she saw, she said yes without hesitation. She walked his land for 2 hours and said almost nothing, and then at the edge of his largest slough, she crouched down and crumbled the soil between her fingers, the way Mr. Bergman had taught her by example, and she said, "It's not dead, it's empty. There's a difference." She heard him catch his breath. She walked him through everything: the aerator, the circulation, the fish, the patience, the watching. She loaned him her father's scribblers and her own. She told him it would take 3 years before the soil showed what she would call real movement, and 5 before he could trust the system enough to stop worrying about it. She told him the hardest part was not the work but the waiting. And the second hardest part was ignoring the people who told him he was wasting time. She loaned him 20 perch in aerated bags in the back of her truck in early April. She watched him release them into his slough in the same flat gray light she remembered from her own first spring, and she understood something about time that she had not understood when she was 26 and frightened and reading her father's questions in the winter dark. Some things only make sense from the far side of them. Today, if you were to drive the grid roads east of Big R on an early morning in September, you would pass a farmyard that is unremarkable in every visible way. The house is old, the granary needs painting, the equipment is not new, but if you stopped and walked to the east quarter, you would find a slough that has no business being as full as it is given the dry year the province has had. And at its edges you would find soil the color of strong tea, rich and dense and smelling of the living thing it has become. In the study of the farmhouse, on the desk, sit 3 cardboard boxes of spiral-bound scribblers, the original ones, her father's, their covers faded and their pages soft with handling. Beside them is a second stack, nearly as tall, hers, and beside those, just started, a thin new scribbler belonging to a young woman named Petra, Mr. Arsenault's granddaughter, who has begun spending her springs and summers on the Callaway land, learning to read soil and water the way other people's children are learning other things. Wren does not lecture the girl. She shows her. She has her put her hands in the slough water and feel the temperature difference between the circulated side and the still side. She has her hold a handful of soil from the south field against a handful from the untreated corner of the north and feel the difference without being told what the difference means. She teaches her to ask questions and write them down, especially when they don't yet have answers. The story of Wren Callaway is not, in the end, a story about fish or soil or water or even farming. It is a story about what it means to inherit something that is broken and choose to understand it rather than replace it. The experts who came to her farm saw a problem to be solved with a product. They saw depleted inputs and declining yields and a balance sheet that needed correcting. Wren saw what her father had seen, a system that had gone quiet, a relationship that had been broken by a century of one-sided taking. The fish were the beginning, the pump, the circulation, the years of watching and waiting. All of that was the beginning. The real thing, the thing that could not be bought or licensed or sold in a bag, was the willingness to listen to the particular piece of earth she had been given, for as long as it took to understand what it was asking for. And when you feed the land honestly, with patience and with care, it turns out the land has a very long memory. It remembers what it used to be, and slowly, in its own time, it finds its way back.